Okay, so you know how we all have that medicine cabinet, right? Or those vitamins and supplements we take like every single day.
Right.
But like how often do we actually stop and think about, how that stuff is actually made? Like what goes into ensuring the quality of what we're putting into our bodies?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, most people probably don't.
Exactly. So this deep dive is for all those curious minds out there who want to understand, what happens behind the scenes to guarantee the quality of these products that we all rely on.
Yeah, absolutely. And today, specifically, we're going to be focusing on a crucial process, good manufacturing practice audits, or GMP audits for short. And you've been amazing. You've given us a ton of information to work with. We've got everything from the official rules laid out in the Code of Federal Regulations, parts 110, 111, and 211, to the guidance document straight from the FDA. Plus, we've got insights from some really interesting pharmaceutical science books and even some GMP training materials. It's a lot to cover.
Yeah, it is. It's going to be a deep dive for sure. But that's our mission today, right? To really dig deep into how these GMP audits are actually conducted. We want to understand how they make sure that quality is basically built into the manufacturing process from the ground up.
Exactly.
So we're going to be looking at the different techniques auditors use. What are they looking for when they go into a facility? What are they looking for when they look at a company's records? How do they even spot potential problems? And why is it so crucial for them to stay objective throughout the entire process?
Right.
It's like we're getting a backstage pass to see how the safety and effectiveness of our healthcare products are actually protected.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Where do these auditors even begin? What are some of the main strategies or techniques they use to approach these GMP audits?
Well, one of the most fundamental things they do is they actually talk to the people who are making these products. They have these structured interviews with the personnel, the people who handle, manufacturing, processing, packing, even storing the drug products.
Right.
And this is really insightful because, as 21 CFR 211.25b points out, these are the individuals who are directly influencing the quality of what's being produced.
Makes sense.
And talking to them really helps reveal if the training they receive actually translates into their daily work and, how well they understand what they're doing and why they're doing it.
So it's not just about, checking if the machines are working properly. It's about understanding if the people behind those machines actually know what they're doing and why it's important.
Exactly.
So what kind of questions do auditors ask in these interviews to kind of gauge that understanding?
Well, they might ask someone about their understanding of, the step-by-step instructions for a particular task, their standard operating procedures or their SOPs. They'll want to know if they've been trained properly on these procedures. And a really important question is, what would you do if something unexpected happened? Or if you notice a deviation from the norm? And their answers to those questions really help auditors understand the level of quality awareness within the company. Are the quality procedures just rules on paper, or are they really ingrained in the way people work?
I see. So it's really about that company culture. You can have, the most perfect procedures written out. But if people aren't following them or they don't understand why they're important, then it's not going to mean much.
Right.
Now, another key technique we talked about was the thorough record reviews. And this sounds like it could involve a lot of paperwork.
Yeah, it definitely can. But it's a really crucial part of the audit. Meticulously examining the documentation gives the auditors a verifiable history of the manufacturing process
Okay.
and of all the quality control measures that are in place. So think of it like, piecing together a story of how each product was made and tested.
Okay, I like that analogy. So what kind of documents are they scrutinizing? What are they really looking at under a microscope?
Well, at the very core, you have the batch production and control records, which 21 CFR 211.188 goes into detail about. These are like the recipe and the production logbook for each specific batch of medication.
Got it.
They detail everything from, the raw ingredients used, the specific equipment that was involved, to who performed each step and when it was performed. And if there are discrepancies or missing entries in these records, that can be a major red flag.
Right.
It suggests that there might have been issues during manufacturing that weren't properly addressed or documented.
So it's like a detective looking for clues. They want that complete and accurate account of how that particular batch was made.
Exactly.
What else are they looking at in that paper trail?
They'll also carefully examine records related to all the components that go into the final product, as well as the containers, the closures, like the bottle caps and the labels. Regulations like 21 CFR 211.80, 211.122, 211.130, and 211.184 all outline what's required in these areas. It's essential that these materials meet, very strict quality standards. and that they're correctly identified and controlled from the moment they arrive at the facility until they're actually used.
Right.
And it's interesting, these records actually have to be kept for at least 1 year after the product expires,
Wow.
or even 3 years for certain over-the-counter drugs, according to 21 CFR 211.180. So that's a lot of record keeping.
Yeah, it is. It really emphasizes the importance of traceability, knowing exactly where everything came from and where it went.
Absolutely.
So specifically, what are they looking for in these records about, the containers, the closures, the materials?
They're verifying that every incoming shipment of these things was properly sampled, tested, and then approved by the quality control unit before it was used in production.
Okay.
And this is a key point that's highlighted in 21 CFR 211.84a. The actual testing and examination results showing whether the materials were accepted or rejected based on, predefined quality standards are super important.
Uh-huh.
And that's mentioned in 211.184b. This whole process makes sure that only materials that meet the required quality standards actually end up in the final product.
Yeah, you definitely want to catch any problems with the raw ingredients or the packaging right at the beginning.
Exactly.
Before it even gets to the manufacturing stage. Now, what about the machines and the equipment that are actually used to make the products?
Right.
Are there records for those as well?
Oh, absolutely. The procedures for cleaning and maintaining the equipment and utensils, along with the logs that document when and how this was done, are all thoroughly reviewed. Regulations like 21 CFR 211.67b and various GMP training materials really emphasize how critical this is. These procedures need to be incredibly detailed. They have to specify who's responsible for the cleaning, the schedules for when the cleaning happens, the exact methods and materials to be used, and probably most importantly, how contamination is prevented.
Right.
So it's not just, a quick wipe down. It's a whole system designed to ensure cleanliness and to prevent one batch from contaminating another.
Okay, so it sounds like every piece of equipment basically has its own maintenance and cleaning history.
Yeah.
Now, I also remember our sources mentioning something about calibration records.
Yes, the records of calibration and maintenance for all the equipment are absolutely vital. And, this includes the initial qualification process, which we saw in a YouTube transcript on 21 CFR 111 GMP laboratory overview.
Okay.
And this involves something called design qualification, installation qualification, operational qualification, and performance qualification.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
I know, right? DQ, IQ, OQ, and PQ.
Okay, so can we break that down a little bit? Like, what does each of those qualifications mean?
Sure. So think of DQ like verifying that the design of the equipment is actually suitable for its intended purpose.
Okay,
IQ is all about confirming that it was installed correctly.
gotcha.
OQ is making sure that it actually operates the way it's supposed to under controlled conditions.
Right.
And then PQ is proving that it consistently produces a quality product in a real-world manufacturing environment.
Okay, so it's like taking it through a series of tests, basically.
Yeah, and major equipment should go through all these stages to ensure that it's, properly designed, installed, working correctly, and that it consistently produces the desired result.
Right.
And then after any significant changes or repairs, or even if equipment is moved, it might need to be requalified, and all of that needs to be documented.
Wow.
And, even smaller mobile equipment like pH meters and balances, they need to be calibrated regularly to make sure they're accurate.
Okay.
Although they might not require that full qualification process every time they're used. So it's all about ensuring that every tool used in manufacturing is accurate and reliable.
So it's like every piece of equipment has its own quality passport, basically.
Yeah, I like that.
It has to prove its credentials. Now, what's another key area of records that auditors really focus on?
Another really important area is how a company handles complaints. Written procedures for dealing with complaints are mandatory. And we saw that mentioned in a YouTube transcript on good documentation practices. Auditors will review those procedures to see if they're thorough and to ensure that all complaints are properly recorded, investigated, and that appropriate actions are taken in response.
Okay.
And, the speed and the thoroughness of those investigations and the corrective actions that are implemented are really strong indicators of a company's commitment to continuous improvement and to patient safety.
Right, so it's not just about making the product. It's about being responsive to feedback and making sure that any issues are addressed quickly and effectively.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about the people, we've talked about the paperwork. It seems like every step leaves a trail that these auditors are carefully following.
Right.
Now, the third major technique we mentioned with on-site observations. So this is where the auditors actually get to see what's happening in real time on the ground, right?
Yeah, exactly. Direct observation of the manufacturing and the laboratory operations is absolutely crucial. It lets auditors verify if what's written in the procedures is actually being followed in practice,
Okay.
and it lets them identify any potential issues that might not be obvious just from looking at the records. So it's all about seeing the reality of the manufacturing environment.
Makes sense. So as they're walking through the facility, what are some of the key things they're paying attention to?
Well, facility design and condition is a primary focus. Auditors assess whether the layout and the construction of the building actually help prevent contamination and make cleaning easier.
Right.
This includes things like having smooth, durable, easy to clean surfaces in areas where the product is directly exposed. Sealed openings in the walls and ceilings, appropriate flooring. And we saw these details in sources like good design practices for GMP pharmaceutical facilities. I'll also check if there's enough space to prevent mix-ups between different products or materials. And that was something we saw highlighted in a YouTube transcript.
So the building itself needs to be designed with quality in mind.
Exactly.
What about the actual work that's being done? What are they observing there?
They're looking very closely at the sanitary operations, including general maintenance, pest control measures, and how waste is handled, as required by 21 CFR 110.35 and various GMP training materials. They also pay very close attention to hand washing and sanitizing facilities and practices,
Right.
referencing regulations like 21 CFR 110.372 and 110.35, and they'll look for things like, are there easily visible signs reminding employees about proper hand hygiene? Those are things they'll definitely be checking.
It's interesting how those simple things can be so critical in this context. What else are they looking at as they're walking through? What other details catch their eye?
They're also looking at how materials are handled and stored.
Okay.
Auditors want to see that raw materials, whether they're liquids or powders in bulk, are stored in a way that protects them from contamination. And that's something that's emphasized in 21 CFR 211.84a and CFR Title 21110.pdf. And finally, they'll assess the ventilation and air control systems to make sure that things like odors, vapors, and any potential airborne contaminants are minimized.
Okay.
And that's in line with 21 CFR 110.20b6 and 211.42b. They'll be checking if fans and air-blowing equipment are properly located and operating correctly, as mentioned in 110.20b6. And in sterile manufacturing areas in particular, you can expect especially intense scrutiny of these systems because the risk of contamination is so high.
Right. So it's a really comprehensive look at everything, from the people to the paperwork to the physical environment,
Exactly.
to try to get a complete picture of the GMP compliance. Now, what happens if an auditor sees something that isn't quite right? How do they actually go about identifying these deviations and then figuring out if a company is truly meeting the required standards?
Well, they use a very systematic approach. They compare everything they observe and every record they review against the established benchmarks. And these benchmarks include the GMP regulations themselves, the company's own detailed standard operating procedures, and any predefined acceptance criteria for tests and manufacturing processes.
Okay, so if something doesn't measure up against those benchmarks, that's noted as a deviation.
Exactly. Any departure from those established standards is noted as a potential noncompliance. And it's important to remember that the observations that auditors make, such as those documented on FDA Form 483, are potential deviations. They need further evaluation by regulatory agencies to determine if they actually constitute a violation. And we saw that highlighted in YouTube transcripts like Understanding FDA Inspections and Data and FDA Clinical Investigator Training course. So a 483 is more like a notification of concerns that need to be looked into further rather than a final judgment.
That's an important distinction to make, so that the company then has a chance to respond to those concerns and provide more information.
Exactly.
Now, I thought this was interesting. A YouTube transcript on accuracy and precision in bioanalysis mentioned that even if test results consistently fall very close to the acceptable limits, that could actually raise a red flag for auditors,
Right.
because it could indicate underlying issues with the testing methods themselves. And that would warrant a closer look. It's like they're not just looking for outright failures, they're also looking for patterns that might point to a problem.
Precisely. They're looking for anything that could potentially impact the quality, the safety, or the effectiveness of the product.
Okay.
And as a comprehensive analysis of FDA Form 483 observations points out, certain regulations tend to be cited more frequently than others, and those often relate to the responsibilities of the quality control unit. 21 CFR 211.22d, the thorough review of production records 211.192, and the establishment of very clear written procedures 211 to 100A. And this kind of gives manufacturers some insight into areas where maintaining full compliance can be particularly challenging.
That's really valuable information for manufacturers to have.
Yeah,
So they can really focus on those areas where maybe things are a bit more tricky.
right.
Now, throughout this whole auditing process, what are some of the critical qualities or practices that the auditors themselves need to have to make sure the audit is both effective and fair?
Well, clear communication is absolutely essential, and Leonard Steinborn discusses this in his GMP So Quality Audit Manual. Auditors have to be able to clearly articulate their findings and any concerns they have,
Okay,
not just during the audit itself, but also in the closing meetings.
right.
This ensures that the company being audited fully understands the observations and they have the opportunity to ask questions.
So it's about being transparent and open and avoiding any surprises at the end of the audit.
Exactly.
What about the auditor's mindset and approach going into this?
Objectivity is paramount. Now, auditors have to base their assessment solely on the evidence and the facts that they gather, sticking strictly to the regulations and to the company's own procedures. They need to avoid letting personal opinions or biases influence their judgment. And we saw this principle of impartiality emphasized in numerous sources. Their role is to assess compliance against those established standards.
Right.
It's not to impose their own views or opinions.
Makes perfect sense. It's about sticking to the facts and the rules. And I've always heard that saying, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen.
Right.
How does that apply to the auditors and the work that they do?
Detailed note-taking is absolutely crucial for auditors. Comprehensive and accurate notes form the foundation of the audit report. They provide the evidence to support the findings.
Okay.
So whether it's an observation that's made on the manufacturing floor, a key point from an interview with personnel, or specific details from reviewing records, thorough documentation is non-negotiable. Like you said, if it's not documented in the auditor's notes, it's as if they didn't see it or hear it.
Right.
And the goal is to really capture all the relevant information, both positive findings and any areas of concern, to provide a true and fair representation of the facility's compliance status.
So a GMP audit is clearly much more involved than just, ticking boxes on a checklist. It's a combination of sharp investigative techniques, a real commitment to objectivity, and a very meticulous approach to documentation.
Absolutely.
And it's all working together to safeguard the quality of the healthcare products that we all depend on.
Right. And the next time you reach for a medication or a supplement, take a moment to think about all those rigorous processes, including these detailed GMP audits that are in place to help ensure its safety and its effectiveness.
I think this deep dive has really shed some light on the best practices in GMP auditing. Now, I'm curious, what stands out to you as the most critical aspect of ensuring quality in pharmaceutical manufacturing? And what other questions do you have about this really complex regulatory landscape? We encourage you to keep exploring and digging deeper into this incredibly important field.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area.
It really is.
And there's always more to learn.